I had actually come home from work, and my daughter was having the time of her life. She was putting pictures all over my face, stickers all over my face, and that's the kind of hard-hitting moment that I realised that I was suicidal and needed to do something about it. I've got a selfie on my phone that I look at quite frequently, as that night is the changing point for me. As I say, everything was rosy, but for some reason I was still miserable. My name's Kenny from Andy's Man Club. I'm a project development champion for the charity, so in a privileged position that I work full time for the charity. I got into the position of working for the charity through my own mental health struggles, being suicidal and being an alcoholic, and then using the group for my own benefit. Walked through the door of Andy's Man Club just to better myself, become a volunteer with this charity, and now work full time for the charity. And I'm in a much better position than I've ever been. My story is slightly different to a lot of people. That I had a very good childhood, had my brothers, good parenthood, and my mum and dad are still together now. Grew up in a good environment, to be honest with you. Left school, got a good apprenticeship in the oil and gas industry. I met my partner quite early on, so when we were 19, met her. Had our first house together at the age of 20. And everything was good. And my life kind of changed a bit when my daughter was born, 2014. And that's when I realised that I wasn't just as happy as I made out to be. As I say, I had a good upbringing, a good job at the time, had a house, and my daughter was there, so everything was ticking the boxes it should be. And I think it wasn't until she was 18 months old that I realised that I was properly struggling and basically was suicidal at that point. Growing up, I was into football, so I was always around football. So a male-orientated life. I had 2 older brothers, and just continued on my life, and just felt like everyone else. I was just part of the groups, and it wasn't until I slightly left school and in that male-orientated in the oil and gas industry with all older boys that I started realising that I wasn't kind of fitting in with a lot of people. I was always grumpy, as I used to call it. Probably looking back now, it was depression, but I was grumpy, very nervous in big groups and things like that. But as I say, I was struggling with spending time with my family was the most important, but I didn't really want to go out to events. I was short-tempered with my daughters, and just grumpy as one of the words I used to use. And my wife was actually struggling with post-natal depression at the time, which affected my time at work. I used to go into work and say I'm needing time off because my wife's struggling, but probably realistically I was struggling as well. To be honest, I just cracked on with life and kept going, though I never had a good friendships, and I couldn't really build on relationships I had with friends because I was grumpy. I didn't want to go out and different things. I did do the seek help through the doctors initially, and actually took time off work. Took 2 weeks off work and got put on anti-depressants at the time. It was one of the stigmas around antidepressants. I was actually scared to tell my work I was put on them. And looking back now, it was just embarrassment and fear of telling them that I was on antidepressants. And that's where I kind of just ticked over and just kept going with life and just keep pushing through as best I can. And the suicidal thoughts, because of my daughter, were always there, but at the same time, because I had my daughter to hold on to, she kept me going through my dark times, to be honest. Had my house and my kid, a good job, but they were the ones that were bringing the struggles to me as well, because I was having to work to pay the bills and having to be a dad, which at a young age, looking back now, I was 23, 24 when I had my daughter, so it's one of the, at that time it was quite young. I was one of the first in my age group to have kids, so it was the pressures of that, and then obviously pressures of coming home to kids, and when you're having a hard day dealing with kids as well was difficult for me. Growing up obviously in the oil and gas industry, we were very male orientated. It was basically chest up and get on with it. For me to show weakness it was never really talked about then or thought of, and you wouldn't show that. A lot of the times back in the days was you'd go to the pub and get on with it, and that was the way to deal with it. For me, I never used to drink. I never used to agree with me very well, and I was always ill after things like that. So I never used to use drink as a go-to. And yeah, just being around males older than me, majority of the time older than me, they were the ones that were just basically chest up and get on with it. And even now, looking back in that male-oriented environment, we lost 2 or 3 work colleagues to suicide. Again, at the time, that suicide was never talked about as a group, as a company. We never spoke about that at the time. So I've been through 2 spells in my life. I was getting married in 2018, and the build up to that, I focused on my physical health, and I lost a lot of weight to the point I probably lost too much weight. Looking back at pictures now, I actually seen a Facebook memory yesterday and I looked ill. Up until 2018, I was doing better. I was still miserable, I was still having bad days, but more good days than bad days. 2018 was a kind of turning point for me again. Got married, but just before I was married, I actually got paid off from the oil and gas industry, so made redundant. At the time, having a young daughter, didn't want to go travelling, and I then become self-employed. And that's kind of the turning point in my life again, when I went back downwards, on a downward spiral. 2018 obviously led to a couple of years after that, we had COVID hit us and things. And for me, actually looking back at that period of time, I had a really good time. People always hate that time, but I loved it because I was spending a week in the house with my family, but then I was spending a week working, so I had a good balance. But the pressures of being self-employed was the kind of downwards for me. Something I'd never planned on, being self-employed or working for myself, but to spend time with my family was most important by that time, and obviously having the wedding booked and honeymoons booked. To go in and get a job was hard. It was difficult to get a job when you had holidays booked in the subcontract world. So I become self-employed basically at that point, and the pressures of jobs coming in, where the next money was coming from, when materials were coming in, a lot of that kind of had a big part to play on my downward spiral. I talked about not having alcohol as a coping mechanism for me. Just after my wedding, I actually started reaching out to alcohol as my coping mechanism, and on the back of that, obviously everyone was coming out of COVID, so for me the business started kicking off again. I started putting myself into work, and I was never the one to say no, so I was working 7 days a week, 12 to 14, 15 hour shifts some days, but then coming home and drinking. So I had started every night basically drinking to cope with the stresses of being busy at work or the pressures of work. And it was never a lot. When you talk to alcoholics, and when I've been to alcoholic groups, they're talking about bottles of vodkas and bottles of whiskies, where I was drinking 3 or 4 bottles of beer, but I was relying on those 3 or 4 bottles of beer to get me to sleep and to numb the pain. Pain it just behind my head was always pain, as I say. It was like having a helmet on, and I used to have to numb that away just to smile to my daughters more than anything. Go to 3 years after the marriage, we were 2021, is when I realised that the alcohol was affecting me massively. At the side of my house, I've got pet birds, and I used to go out to the shed and basically sit in there and was spending time with my pet birds, but I was drinking every night. So spiraling out of control, it got to the stage that I wasn't working. So I always used to say to my wife that if I'm in the house, I'm not making money, so start worrying about it. So when I was not working, what I used to do, I would actually go in my van and sit down the waterfront. But the knock-on effect of that was not getting paid, not paying the bills. That then obviously started affecting the house when she was getting letters for the house. And it was spiraling out of control. And it would come to one night, I was actually out with my birds again, and I think it was probably about 2 in the morning. My wife come out to me, and I was just absolutely steaming. And she says that you need to do something about this drinking and get a grip of yourself. Basically, you're going to lose all of us. The next morning, I woke up and she walked out the house and left me with 2 kids. When I was hungover, absolutely steaming still, basically. And I was just destroyed. That's when the kind of realisation was how much this was affecting not only myself but my family. I'd been back and forth to doctors with depression beforehand. I'd been put back on medication. I was looking at different alcohol groups, Alcohol Anonymous. I was looking at church groups. I was looking at just pretty much everything and anything that I could go to. Andy's Man Club was one of them that it was recommended to me by my doctors. At the time, there was a venue. It was only 20 minutes along the road from me, but it was too far away for me to travel to, and I just couldn't get myself to go. It then led to kind of the tail end of 2021, whereas there was a club opening in my local town, and that's when I kind of made a point of going along to that club just to see what it was all about. Because of that night of being drunk and my wife basically walking out of me, there was a possibility of breaking my marriage up and losing the kids and losing my house. So I had to do something to get myself back on track. Having said that, going to a club for men was never going to be one for me, but I went open-minded, and to be honest, it quite quickly changed my life around by talking about my pressures and my struggles and what I'd been through. Learned a lot about different things that was going on in my life. As I say, I grew up not thinking there was anything wrong with me. Probably looking back now, I suffered with anxiety for probably the last 18 years. I could single it back to being 15-year-old and struggling with anxiety, struggling to fit into different groups and worrying about going to different places. And that's when I first realised that I was really struggling, was when I started talking about my problems and listening to other people's problems. Was as a big turning point in my life, as being able to be open and honest, and listening to other people as well has helped me. I could relate to an 18-year-old who's had a lot of domestic abuse or a lot of troubled childhood, but I could also relate to the 60, 70-year-old who was just going through life troubles as well. And that's where it had that connection for me, and the realisation that what I had been going through for the last 10 years wasn't actually going through myself, and it wasn't just me being grumpy, it was me being depressed and going through depression, and obviously anxiety on the back of that. I think recently, as a lot of people have talked about anxiety, but more people learning about anxiety, and I think we've all suffered with anxiety for the last 20, 30 years without actually realising what anxiety was. Being able to talk about that and listen to other people, it's massively helped me. Men supporting men is hugely important, because we grew up in the industry and we grew up in the lifestyles that we keep everything to ourselves. What we are going through, nobody else should be going through it on their own. But realistically, when we're opening up and talking about it, pretty much every other man out there is going through very similar situations. We're all there going through these struggles, keeping it to ourselves, not helping ourselves by keeping it to ourselves, but by listening to other people talking and having these conversations. For me now, I could phone a couple of boys that I've met through Andy's Man Club and say, do you want to go out for a coffee, or do you want to go out for a walk? And for me, that gets me through that week, because I can have these conversations and just get things off my chest. I was going through a lot of times where I was numb. I didn't enjoy simple things, even taking my kids to the park. I never enjoyed things like that. But by bettering myself and being open and honest about the struggles I've been through, I can take my kids to the park. Most important bit I do now is take my daughters to school and nursery, and I love doing things like that. I now go into my daughter's classes, which I'd never do before. And the impact on that has been huge as well. I think it's all good bettering myself, but the impact it's had on my family was huge. I think the impact that it had on my daughter was massive in my own mental health. The anxiety, when we talk about anxiety, I had to take my daughter out of dancing classes because she was being sick at the thought of going into a class. Again, that's down to anxiety. To see a 7-year-old suffering with anxiety was dreadful for me. But now I've bettered myself. She's in a lot better place. Just last year, she stood in front of a church at the school at the end of the year and done a speech in front of the whole class, the whole school, and parents. And for me to see that's made my journey worthwhile. But over my life, I've kept myself to myself, and I've never really created great friendships just because the struggles I went through. I used to keep it to myself, and when I got too close to somebody, I'd back away again. And now, after attending Andy's Man Club, I've probably got a group of 20 or 30 close friends. My 2 work colleagues now that I work with there, we do daily check-ins, and it's the most honest I've ever been. And we'll always do that. We'll start the phone call off and, how are you feeling today? It's not about work, or it's not about what's going on, it's how are you? And yeah, I'm back going to the football as well, something that I've struggled for since my youngest come along. So basically the last 10 years I've stopped going to the football because of anxiety, because of the friendship. I'd lost that connection. Due to attending the Andy's Man Club, I've now got 3 or 4 boys who are season ticket holders who I go every week to the games with now, so it gives me that connection and back enjoying going to football every week, and it's gave me a switch off from work as well, which is the most important bit sometimes. I think first and foremost for anybody that's going through struggles or who's out there just keeping things to themselves is just talk to people, may it be your friends, your family, the stranger in the streets, your neighbours. Most importantly, NHS are out there as well, and there's different organisations out there for getting help as well. Don't be afraid to talk to people and get things off yourself. The hardest bit is asking for help. No matter what walk of life you're in, the hardest bit is asking for help, and to do that, to make that phone call to the doctors or to make that phone call to your friend or a family member is the most important bit. Just being open and honest, having the conversations. And I always say that you could be speaking to a cashier in the local Asda supermarket and you can have that conversation, just how's your day been? It's a simple question, but you're open and honest, and having a conversation sometimes is all it takes.